Thin Wood Walls, Chapter 16. Dad knew one of the farm foremen. He was able to land a job a few days after he arrived, which meant a little more money for us. Not much else changed, but I wasn't disappointed. Not yet. I was learning patience, and with him around, every day seemed brighter, as if a layer of clouds had burned away. Our days settled into a routine. Dad and Mom going off to work, Grandmother going off to visit, or, if her legs were bothering her, staying in the room and reading a newspaper or working on her flowers. Me going off to school. Dad came home tired every day, but he looked healthier. He gained weight. At day's end, he would walk, sometimes alone, sometimes with me or me and Mom. Sometimes Grandmother would go. We always stopped at the fence and paid our respects to the sunset, our first star. I wrote to Mike. Dad and Mom had already written to tell him of Dad's homecoming, but they hadn't told him of the timing. I, too, was careful not to let him know he and Dad had come within hours of seeing each other. I had told Grandmother why Mike wasn't allowed to go through the gate, and what good had it done. He heard the out-loud anger, the resentment in my voice, and she became upset. Had our words crept inside his head, giving him thoughts of leaving us early? And sharing with Mike this other burden, the reunion, barely missed, would relieve me but weigh on him. He already had so much on his shoulders. I wrote to May and told her where Mike might be going, that we hadn't heard from him yet. I said to find us a sponsor, that my marbles were getting dusty. A letter came from Mike. We saved it, unopened, until we were all together that night, then sat at the table and listened as Mom read it. Hitler was still in business, Mike said. The 442nd was shipping out the next day, destination somewhere in Europe. They were sailing from an East Coast port, crossing the Atlantic. France was still a possibility, he said, but it was probably too early for France. North Africa had been a choice, but North Africa was ours now. Italy had become the betting favorite. He missed us. "I'll keep my helmet on, Mom," he said. He didn't say anything to Dad. He was moving too fast for our letters to catch him. One evening, toward the end of May, Dad came home late. He'd been walking. He said, his face was dark from the sun. "And something else." "What is it, Tomio?" Mom said. "A man, one of the men I work with, was shot today," he said. "The guard thought he was trying to escape through the gate. He was only trying to catch up to the truck." "He is dead?" Grandmother said. "In the hospital," Dad said. "Not good." The hospital. I felt sorry for the man. Grandmother had gotten a high fever once and refused to go to the camp hospital. A stop on the way to the cemetery, she said. The next day, word spread through Tule. The man, Shoichi James Okamoto, was dead. Unrest boiled up once again. Because internee leaders demanded an investigation, one was done. When it was finished, the guard was found blameless, except for misuse of government property, the bullet. He was fined $1. June arrived. School got out. More time on my hands. I tried to pass it by playing baseball. I hadn't touched a basketball since my last day at Ray's house. Or going on walks, reading the newspapers, catching up on things with Dad. But it was mostly one way. He wanted to talk about what I'd been doing, what Mike and I had done before Mike joined the Army. Dad was hungry for what he'd missed in the years he was gone. I asked him questions, but his answers were short. He didn't like talking about his days in Montana and New Mexico. I spent a lot of time thinking about Mike, wondering where he was, how he was, and wishing there was some way I could find out. But the newspapers didn't say anything about the 442nd. I had to guess, and my guessing always put him in the middle of some terrible battle where men on both sides fell like ripening cherries in a hailstorm. So when I learned of D-Day, the Allied invasion of France on June 6th, I pictured Mike coming ashore on the bloody beaches of Normandy, bullets whistling past his head, bombs blowing geysers of sand and water high above him. My imagination cursed me to long days of wanting to read the newspapers and magazines, but not wanting to read them, waiting for the mail, but not wanting to look at it, and dreading the sight of the Western Union couriers with their telegrams of tears, the army cars with their messengers of loss. I'd seen the gold stars on flags hanging in barracks windows. Those gold stars meant a mom had lost a son in the war. I couldn't stand the thought of one of those flags hanging in our window. I usually read the San Francisco Chronicle or Life magazine. Both of them were for sale at the canteen. But one day, Grandmother came home from her friend, Mrs. Tatzaki's, with pieces of Honolulu newspaper. Mrs. Tatsaki had a niece in Hawaii, where there were many Japanese Americans, and a nephew in the 100th Battalion, an all-Nisei unit of soldiers from Hawaii. Mrs. Takazaki's niece sent her aunt articles from the Honolulu newspapers where there was news of the 100th or other Army unit that had big share of Japanese Americans from Hawaii, the 442nd. Grandmother called me to the table, and we sat and traded articles back and forth. The paper was more than a week old, but I found reports on the 100th and the 442nd. The 100th, the Purple Heart Battalion, it was called, because of all the casualties it had suffered, was battling its way through Italy. The 442nd was still at sea, official destination unknown. I felt better knowing that someone was paying attention to the Nisei soldiers, that I'd be able to see stories, late or not, on what they were doing. Mrs. Takazaki had promised to share whatever she got with us, and Grandmother said Mrs. Nomura's granddaughter in Illinois would send reports from her newspapers. The papers on the other side of the country treat our soldiers like citizens, Grandmother said. I got a letter from Ray. I tried to picture his face. I couldn't. How long had it been since I last saw him? How much had he changed? Was he as tall as a man now? I went by your old house, he wrote. A new family was there, working in the yard. I saw a mom and a dad and 2 boys. I couldn't talk to them. I had to leave. I felt hollow suddenly. All for one, he said at the end. I wrote back with my news, and one for all. I put Ray's letter in my duffel with the rest. I didn't say anything to my family. Ray had shared his burden with me. 2 of us were enough to carry it. Sandy knocked on our door one evening after supper. I introduced him to Dad, who said he was glad to meet him and looked like he meant it. Mom must have told him of Sandy's kindnesses. Even Grandmother smiled. She offered him a chair, and he sat on its edge, dangling his cap between his knees, kneading it nervously with his big fingers. I'm leaving tomorrow, he said. For good? I said. He nodded and looked at my parents. Thanks for letting me spend time with your sons. He looked at Grandmother. With your grandsons. I know you're all proud of them. You should be. My eyes clouded over. It's been a privilege knowing you folks. I wish we could have met under different circumstances. Thank you for all you have done, Dad said. Sandy got to his feet and took a piece of paper from his pocket. This is my address in case you'd care to write me. I'd love hearing from any of you. He handed me the paper and walked to the door. Wait, I said. I went to my duffel and took out my journal and tore out a back page. On it, I had written something for him. Thinking of the sea, of what lies across it, he still finds time for me. I gave him the page. Thanks, I said, for everything. He read the poem, smiling, nodding. This is great, he said. Great, he cleared his throat. Mind if I share it? No, I said. She'll love it, he said, and I knew who he meant. I'd like to see more of your writing sometime, Mr. Twain. Okay, I said. We shook, my hand disappearing in his one last time. I thought about asking him if he'd given Mike and me the books. I wanted to thank him, but some questions are better left unasked, and I wasn't sure I could use my voice. "I'll miss you," I managed. "Take care, Joe." He gave me a hug, a bone crusher. I smelled allspice. "We will pray for you," Mom said, and I was glad to hear her words. We had drifted away from church, but Mom hadn't given up on prayer. Now we had 2 soldiers who needed watching over, and I was sure Mom's prayers would be much more powerful than mine. "Thanks, Mrs. Hanada." Sandy opened the door and walked out into the night. Grandmother didn't say government. A letter came from Mike. He was okay, at least when he wrote the letter. I thought of the faraway stars, how their light could reach us long after they had died out. I pushed the thought away. He hadn't been involved in the invasion of Normandy, after all. "We landed in Naples, Italy," he said, then arrived in a place called Anzio 2 days too late to help kick the Nazis out of Rome. The 442nd was going to be joined by the 100th Battalion, he said. Then they were going to go to war. "Sorry I missed you, Dad," he wrote at the end, "but I'm glad you're with the rest of the family at last. I'll see you after we're done burying Mr. Mustache. Soon." I reread Mike's letter, trying to make sense of it, wishing for a map. What I did know was he was going to be fighting now, in the thick of things. And I knew if I read any accounts of the Purple Heart Battalion, the 100th, Mike's battalion, the 3rd Battalion of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team would be nearby. Unrest continued at Tule Lake. Every day I watched as unhappy residents and grim-faced soldiers eyed one another with suspicion. Everyone wanted to be somewhere else, but most of us had nowhere to go. And according to what we had heard and read, many of our old neighbors didn't want us back. July began with a murder. A man was stabbed to death outside a barracks. Tension in the camp swept higher. The Chronicle reported it, but barely. An alien, they called him, as if he didn't matter. Day after day, I checked the newspaper's list of war casualties. Wounded, dead, missing, imprisoned. I knew there were Japanese Americans dying and wounded and missing and imprisoned, but I didn't see any Japanese names. It was as if they too didn't matter. Another letter came from Mike. He joked about the food, the bad weather, the latrines, the 100th Battalion guys, and their pigeon that no one could understand. Those guys have been over here a long time, fighting, suffering casualties. They don't think much of us newcomers. So now we have to prove ourselves to our own people, too. Other than that, he didn't talk about the war. I looked between the lines. My imagination took me to scary places. I put his letter on the wall, thankful for it. I asked my parents and grandmother if they knew where I might find a map of Europe, or at least Italy. The library, Mom thought. The canteen, Dad suggested. Grandmother bought me a map. Another friend of hers gave it to her. A gold star, Mom. She didn't need the map any longer. It was frayed at the folds and discolored and wrinkled, as if someone had been studying it with their fingers. But all the countries of Europe were there. I spread it out on the table, and Grandmother and I studied and pointed and guessed for a long time, as if we were planning a wonderful vacation and just needed to decide where on Italy's boot we should go. My parents came home, and we all looked at the map together as if we were hypnotized, as if we expected to see a miniature version of Mike moving across its surface, shouldering a gun, waving up at us. That night, Mom and Dad borrowed a neighbor's chessboard and played chess while Grandmother read an old Life magazine that contained a photo of an Issei soldier who had been blinded by the explosion of a mine while fighting in Italy. An American hero, the magazine called him. I sat on my cot and puzzled over entries for my journal, and wrote, and puzzled. Mike was already a hero. He didn't have to prove it by being blinded. Or worse, he didn't have to prove it to me. More days passed. I tried to stay out of the sun. I waited for mail. I read newspapers, skipping over headlines that screamed Jap, squirming at editorial page cartoons that showed a buck-toothed, squinty-eyed enemy. I remembered a lifetime earlier when someone had left a similar drawing on my desk at school. Honolulu papers had some news of the Nisei, but those papers were old. So were the clippings sent by Molly Nomura. The Newell Star had stories that relied on other papers and letters and rumors, and suffered from censorship. West Coast papers had almost nothing in them about Japanese American soldiers. Finally, the July 23, 1944 edition of the Chronicle had something. A report from the Italian front headlined "Down from the Hills" talked about the 100th Battalion, that it included some Japanese Americans, that the battalion had come out of the hills and captured the town of Livorno. I unfolded the map and found Livorno on Italy's coast. It looked close to France, close to where the Nazi army would run out of room to backpedal and begin fighting like a cornered pack of hyenas. August arrived. Harvest began. Headlines in the Chronicle said, "Greatest gains since invasion." An article reported that a Pennsylvania man who had correctly predicted June 6th as D-Day was now predicting that Germany would stop fighting on August 4th. I prayed he was right. In the comics, Superman was making short work of some bad guys. I wished he were real, that he could wipe out the bad guys who had started this war. But he wasn't real. And August 4th came and went, with Germany still fighting. Prayers and wishes. Neither one was working. Letters arrived. One from Mike. It was short and scribbled, and the paper was smeared with dirt. I pictured him writing, sitting under the lip of a foxhole. He told us more jokes. They were empty, but we didn't care. He was still writing. He was still alive. The letter went on the wall. One from May. My parents are talking to people about sponsorships for your family. Don't get your hopes too high, Dad said, but he looked hopeful. Because of me, Grandmother said, because I answered yes, no. Not because of you, Dad told her, because of me, because it is a difficult process, but it is kind of May's family to speak for us. One from Ray, hoping the war would be over soon so Mike could come back, so we could return to the White River Valley. He didn't say anything about people there not wanting us. All for one, he said, but I was getting good at reading between the lines. I wrote back to them. One for all, I told Ray, wondering if I would ever see him again. His letter went in my bag with the rest of my White River Valley life. I pinned May's letter to the wall. I kept reading every newspaper I could find, every article Grandmother brought home. There was one about General DeWitt getting a secret assignment, about him being the one who had ordered our internment. Dimwit, Grandmother said. I would like to choose his secret assignment. I kept reading, day after day. The Allies were moving toward Paris. Hitler was on the run. But as far as I knew, Mike was still in Italy. Those cornered hyenas were making a stand. I kept looking, and General Eisenhower's army, not General Clark's, which included the 442nd, continued moving across France. Maps of France appeared on the front pages. Allies were in sight of the Eiffel Tower. Then entering Paris. But where was Mike? I studied the map, the Honolulu papers, the clippings from Illinois. I waited for a letter, hoping. I walked to the fence with Dad and wished on stars. I always made the same wish. So did he. Mom preferred praying. I prayed that her powerful prayers were working. Grandmother did her part and busied herself by reading and talking. Finally, in the first week of September, another letter came from Mike. He wasn't supposed to tell us where he was, but he did anyway. Italy, still, but he didn't know for how long. He was keeping his helmet on. He missed us. School started again, and I was grateful. It gave me something to think about besides Mike. Dad was busy with the harvest, Mom with her job, Grandmother with her friends. We didn't talk about Mike much, but he was always in our hearts. At night, when the lights were out and my parents had quit murmuring to each other and Grandmother had begun to snore softly, I lay with my eyes closed and imagined him in the room, drifting off to sleep. I heard his breathing slow and deepen and settle into a rhythm. I tried to match it as I lay on my side and closed my eyes and pictured him in a cot next to me, close enough to touch. September ended with a sigh. We remembered Mike's birthday by standing at the fence, my parents, Grandmother, and me, and talking about him into the night. When my birthday arrived, Mom and Dad gave me a basketball. Grandmother gave me a new map of Europe. They sang Happy Birthday, a sad and lonely-voiced version, until the Suzuki family joined in through the wall. We laughed and invited them over for cake, but part of me still felt resentful that we had so little privacy. Shikata ga nai, I told myself. Our next letter from Mike was dated September 25th. A bunch of new guys have come in, he said, to replace the Hawaiian guys who wandered off in search of poi and pineapple. I didn't get it at first. He means they have lost men. Dad's voice sounded raspy. It is supposed to be light-hearted. Light-hearted. Maybe, but not funny. It was the first time he'd talked about losing men, and I didn't like it. The 442nd was leaving Italy, Mike said, shipping out, going to a new place to play tag with the Nazis. He didn't know where. It was a secret, but rumors were flying. The Hawaiians were betting on France, and Mike said he wouldn't want to bet against anyone who lived by the motto, "Go for broke." He guessed they were right. I didn't know whether to be glad or upset that they were leaving Italy. Maybe they were going somewhere safer. Maybe they weren't. That night, I studied the newspaper. I pored over the new map until it grew wrinkles and ridges of its own. Mike thought France this time, but where? Paris was liberated and safe, a good place, but they wouldn't need him in Paris. Battles were raging elsewhere. There were stories of super armies guarding Germany, Nazi death camps. It was October now. Mike could be up to his neck in war. I went to the fence with Dad. I went for a walk. I came back and wrote in my journal of Mike's funny stories of war that made no one laugh, and the scary accounts we read elsewhere. What if the stories are just tales, like men from Mars, beasts under a bed?